Hello, Bobcats. I'm Miss Barker. I teach fourth grade at Woodland, and I'm here to read to you Bearwalker. Chapter 16, A Name. How can things happen so fast and yet also drag on so slowly at the same time? The crazy flurry of activity that started with that frenzied knocking on the door has been followed by what seems like an interminable period of waiting. But when I look at my watch, I see that only an hour has passed since Mr. Mac stumbled in, carrying Mr. Osgood's pack. Only an hour. It feels to me as if it were days ago, as if we've all been here waiting, not knowing what is going on, to happen for an absolute eternity. I'm amazed at how calm Mrs. Osgood is now. Or maybe I'm not. I know what it is like to be in denial, to absolutely refuse to accept, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that someone you love has just disappeared and will never come back. At first, all of the adults in the kitchen had been so stunned at the sight of Mr. Osgood's jacket that they hadn't thought about the kids in the main room. Everyone had been wakened and freaked out by the noise of Mr. Mac's arrival. The confusion hadn't been helped by the sight of him being hustled into the kitchen to be questioned. Mr. Smiler and the parent chaperones had just started to get the kids semi-settled down again when Mrs. Osgood's loud, "No! No!" had come ringing out of the kitchen. That had stirred things up again and started what sounded like a stampede behind me in the main hall. I didn't even think about what I was doing. I quickly pulled the kitchen door shut, cutting off the sight of Mrs. Osgood and that frighteningly bloody green jacket. A big head bumped against my hip. It was Po' Boy. Together, the big black dog and I turned to face the crowd that actually stopped surging forward and got quiet when I thrust my hand up toward them, palm out. Asa was at the front of the crowd, and he took a hesitant step toward me. "What's going on?" he said in a shaky voice. His face was pale. Even though he was still physically taller than me, I realized at that moment both how scared he was and how calm I felt. I also came to the recognition that there really was nothing that scary about him after all. He and his friends, who were huddling together behind him like chickens expecting to get picked off by a hawk, looked like nothing more than frightened little boys. I scanned the other faces in front of me, boys and girls who were my classmates, but seemed to be seeing me in a new way. Harl, Cody, Willie, Heidi, Tara, and everyone else. They were all waiting. Even Mrs. Smiler and the parent chaperones who were at the back. They wanted reassurance from me. Even those boys who'd made me feel so miserable for so long. I knew in my heart that if I survived this night, I would never be afraid of Asa and his crew again. For the first time, I understood something that my mom had told me one day when I came home after being picked on by bigger kids. Bullies, she said, act that way because they're afraid. I also knew, for whatever reason, that what I had to do now was say something to help everyone calm down. "It's okay," I said. "Mr. Mac got hurt, but it wasn't bad. Mr. Wilbur will be out in a second to explain things. Settle, okay?" It wasn't what you'd call oratorial eloquence, but it worked. The kids calmed down, no longer milling about like a herd of cattle about to head for the nearest cliff, and Mrs. Smiler moved to the front. She raised her hands in a shooing gesture. "Okay, campers," she said. "You heard the man. Party's over. Everybody retreat to their own crash pad." Then she returned, smiled at me, and leaned close. "Baron," she said in a soft voice, "you are one cool dude." A hand grasped my shoulder from behind. "I'll second that," Mr. Wilbur said. "Think I need to say anything to the kids now, Ginny?" Mrs. Smiler shook her head. "I think it's all groovy for now. What they need to do is get some sleep, or they'll be basket cases tomorrow." "More than they already are?" Mr. Wilbur smiled, but I could tell that his smile was forced. "What is up?" Mrs. Smiler said. "We're still figuring it all out." Mr. Wilbur shook his head. His brief smile vanished now. "Let's just say I was a little too right in my misgivings about our new camp director and his staff." Misgivings. Not a bad word for how I'm feeling now. Not fear, but a vague uncertainty about what exactly is going to happen next. Aside from being certain that, whatever it is not going to be good. I slipped back into the kitchen after the other kids were settled into their sleeping, or lying awake with their eyes wide open while being filled with dread, areas. Po' Boy, of course, has followed me, although he leaves my side to trot over to Mrs. Osgood, who kneels down and puts her arms around him. Her eyes are moist, but her face looks calm now. I'm trying to be unobtrusive, but Mr. Wilbur notices me. For a moment, I think he's going to ask me to leave the room. Then he shakes his head and smiles in resignation. You might as well stay and hear the rest of this, Baron, Mr. Wilbur says. He looks over toward Mr. Mack, slumped in a chair, under the alert gaze of Mr. Philo, who is now holding the shotgun. It won't hurt to have one more pair of eyes keeping watch on our deceptive friend over there. He motions for me to move over near the door that leads outside. It's on the other side of the room from Mr. Mack, but plenty close to hear all that he says as he takes deep, shuddering breath and starts to speak. I needed someone who knew the area. That is why I hired him. Mr. Mack doesn't look up. He keeps his gaze on his bloody hands. It is as if he's talking to himself, unaware that anyone else is here. How could I have known who he was and what he was really up to? It is certainly not my fault. Not my fault at all. Where's my husband? A sharp voice cuts in. Mr. Mack lifts his head in surprise, as if realizing for the first time he's not alone. George, Mrs. Osgood reminds him, holding up her husband's coat with her left hand, her right hand on Po' Boy's head. Where is he now? The big dog catches the tone in her voice. A growl starts deep in its chest. Mr. Mack cowers in his chair. Keep that dog away from me. I don't know. All I know is that Walker handed me that pack with that jacket in it. All he was supposed to do was stop him from calling for help. He wasn't supposed to do anything to him. I didn't know the man was a killer. But you never saw my husband's body, did you? Mrs. Osgood was standing. For some reason, she looks less distressed than before, as she holds back Po' Boy. The huge black Labrador's growling has gotten much louder now, and he is baring his teeth at the man who is shrinking even further back. No, I didn't see his body. Mrs. Osgood nods. Good, she says, pulling Po' Boy back with her as she sits down. She smiles over at me. George is not an easy man to kill, son, she says. Mr. Philo kicks the leg of Mr. Mack's chair. You said he was a killer and that you didn't know who he was. I assume you meant that the man who calls himself Walker, White Bear? Explain what you meant. Mr. Mack runs a hand through his hair. An officious tone comes back into his voice. You fail to understand, sir, he says. Staffing decisions are difficult, even under the best of circumstances. I wasn't able to obtain a resume, you know. I would not expect a former basketball player to appreciate the difficulty of being an efficient administrator when lacking the requisite access to properly background check one's employees. Mr. Wilbur rolls his eyes toward the ceiling. I know what he means by that. This guy, Mr. Mack, is whack. Mr. Philo nudges the barrel of the shotgun against Mr. Mack's shoulder. Speak English, pal, he says. I'm only a dumb ex-jock. Careful with that shotgun, Mrs. Osgood warns. It has a hair trigger. It would smart if he was to get hit with the load I've got in those shells. Mr. Philo steps back. Speak, he says again. How do you know the man's a killer? And who he is? How do I know? Mr. Mack's face is defiant now, his tone superior. Do you recall my other two counselors? As soon as they saw that, he looks toward Mrs. Osgood and her husband's jacket, which is now neatly folded and placed on the floor by her feet. That blood. I could see from the looks on their faces that they wanted to get as far away from all of this as they could. They were petty criminals, but they were not murderers. And then when he told us who he really was, that was the last straw for them. They turned and ran. Mr. Max shudders and puts a hand to his forehead. He grinned at me when they ran. Then he pulled out that long knife of his and went after them. Mr. Mack is talking louder and faster now, his hands tapping his knees as he speaks. Even though they split up, they didn't get far, either of them. He caught them, rounded them up. He can see in the dark, like some animal. And he's so fast, so strong. I heard their screams. They screamed, and they kept screaming. I didn't look back, though. I was running, too, running and running and running until I got here. Mr. Mack's voice slows down and then stops, like a toy whose battery has run down. It is more awful than I thought. Everyone is shocked. But Mr. Philo is not too shocked to speak. You still didn't answer my second question, pal. Who is he? Mr. Mack whispers the name, but everyone hears it. Mrs. Philo raises both her hands to her mouth. It's a name we all know. Jason Jones. And that is the end of chapter 16. Stay tuned for more episodes.